Hello, we're back. We're back for this track 2 of API Days, and I will be really glad to moderate again this track. And we will start by a speaker that we really like the content. It's about like API specification and how to build accessible API specification with traditional engineering teams. And I'm glad to have Griffin on stage. Can we have Griffin? Hello, Griffin. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you so much. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing really well. Yeah, we liked your talk last time. We really want to have it again to open this track on API specification. So yeah, the stage is yours for 20-minute plus 5-minute questions.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining my talk today. My name is Griffin Solitail. I am currently a developer advocate at Dolby.io. I believe this is the third or fourth time I've been giving this talk at API Days, so I'm very excited to continue sharing this content and trying to encourage everybody towards just an overall better development experience with the APIs that we are all building. So the first thing that I like to do is I like to talk a little bit about myself. Once again, I work at Dolby.io, where I am actually working on a new environment at a company that's been around for a long time, where Dolby's been around for over 40 years, but Dolby.io is a new endeavor where we're trying to make developer-first APIs. This involves things like media enhancement in analytics, real-time communications, as well as a recent acquisition we made of Millicast for low latency streaming. So we have three separate products that all functionally have different API specifications that I have to help just kind of be an advocate for the external developer and work together to try to make these as usable, as intuitive, and as fun to use as possible. I've been in this space for over 4 years using REST APIs the entire time, and I've kind of been from baby startups from around 20 or less people to large corporations of thousands of people. So I have a big focus on API integrations. So I have spent a lot of time with things like building Slack apps, with things like building things on Twilio, with things like building things with Google Cloud. So I've spent a lot of time on different documentation pages, which kind of have made me think of what works and what doesn't work in terms of actually having a good API. So chances are you need to work on your API spec. Most of us are here. This is just kind of where we are in the given space that we're at right now. And we have a lot of different common issues that tend to kind of plague the average API specification, where you can have things like unclear or out-of-date documentation, where you're having a rapidly evolving product, but your teams don't really want to work on the docs. They don't want to update it. They don't want to keep it up to date. That's just too much work. They just want to keep on developing. And it's always a question, whose job is it? Whose responsibility is it? It can also be hard to update existing Open API spec because oftentimes it is just kind of a messy amount of spaghetti code getting in the way. You don't know where the areas you're trying to edit are. You have too many files talking to each other in different ways. It's not well organized. And you also are just showing a lot of different inconsistencies. So one of my pet peeves is when I see inconsistent parameters across endpoints, where when I'm using an API, I want to expect it to work the same way between different endpoints if I'm using the same parent API spec. So when you're kind of calling things in different directions, that tends to be a very common problem that I see. And there's usually a slow process to actually communicate these changes both internally, so that we're updating the specification, we're updating the documentation, as well as externally, where when you are deprecating something or you're updating something, you want to make sure your users both know that it happened and also know how to migrate so that it's working as easily and as quickly as possible. This is less of an issue with API first development, which is why I'm focusing this with traditional engineering teams, but is also just overall a bunch of good tips that you can learn along the way as somebody who is working in the API workspace. So what can we do about it? The one thing that I like to start off with is keeping a modular spec, because I think that this is a technical conference. I want to keep it in the technical world first, where it's very important to kind of treat your specification the same way that you might treat your actual code, where if you're writing the same block of code over and over and over again in a lot of different code files that you have, that's inefficient. That's something that we already know, is saying, no, you can make that a helper function and call that multiple times instead of having to repeat the same block of code over and over and over again. You can do the same thing in an open API specification, which is where the $ref objects come in, where the $ref objects allow you to point to other areas within your open API specification, whether it is in the same file or in a helper file, so that you can reuse them throughout your code. So on the right is the actual open API documentation showing you how to do it, both in JSON and YAML. But this is going to help you identify patterns in new endpoints. So for example, if you're going to have an input parameter or an output parameter that is going to take the same format the entire time, make sure that the names and the descriptions and just the way that it accepts the content is the same unless there is a specific exception of this. Additionally, we want to make sure that we're documenting what all of them do. So make sure that you're using comments, make sure you're using your internal documentation. Just make sure that it's very clear where everything is if you're looking for different things to kind of modify, and how to change them, so that people are just knowing what to do immediately instead of having somebody thrown in to just kind of the Wild West and not knowing where to go. Make sure to check out the documentation on it, because it is there for a reason. You kind of want to make sure that you're using good documentation for how to build your spec, so that you can build your own good documentation of your own spec. Additionally, this is actually a comment that I got from feedback from my last ones, which I have been using, but thought was a good thing to show off. Use a linter. So there are so many different linters out there, which are there to help validate your API descriptions and your API spec to make sure it is valid open API, but also makes it a little bit picky in terms of consistent formatting and consistent naming, so that you are facilitating consistency. It's able to support a lot of different languages, and they are built in a lot of different areas as well. So you can even see on this image over here that I took from Open API Tools, which is a very great resource in terms of just everything Open API related, both for linters, for documentation tools, and all of that. It's going to show you all the languages they were built in, as well as all the different versions they support. So it's another important thing to kind of keep in mind, that you are using tools that are appropriate for the version of your open API spec that you are actually using. You can even integrate these directly into your IDE. There are VS Code extensions that allow you to do the linting. Some popular ones are Spectral from Stoplight. Redoctly has one built in. IBM has one if you're an IBM fan. So definitely check them out and make sure that you're taking advantage of these free and open source tools that are available to you to make sure that your spec is doing well. So here's an example of our own API spec actually using these references and actually kind of using this code over and over again. So on the top two images, you can see two different components where we are referencing the media input location. And the way that we are using this is, you can see within input, we have the $ref, and it's a input helpers.yaml/media input location. So we have this helper file going across two different API specifications, so two different files that we're able to reuse between these different things. So if we look at the bottom left, we can see what the media input location actually is, where we have the description and we have even more references. So we can keep on referring things over and over and over again, so that we don't have to keep on repeating the same code. We can actually use it in the right place. Where, for example, the public location reference is actually going to show us the title, the type, the format, the example, and description that you're going to expect in an actual kind of parameter you're going to be putting inside of your API specification. We're working smarter, not harder, so that things are both less code, so it's less complicated, but then also just easier to use if you're continuing to add more endpoints to your specification. Next, I do like to talk about authentication, where there's always a balance between security and simplicity. One easy solution towards this is using OAuth2 tokens, where if you can integrate with something like Google or Microsoft or Okta, to be able to let people use their existing credentials to authenticate to something that's actually working, they don't have to create new passwords. They don't have to figure out what their API keys are, and you tend to have pretty good security. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this, where you can use basic authentication, you can use bearer tokens, and you can just use plain old APIs. Though at the same time, it is very important to make sure that you do have proper key management tools. You want to make sure that your users are able to rotate keys in case they are leaked, but also encourage people to rotate their keys regularly anyway, just because that is a good practice to have. You can also separate API keys per application, so you can generate a bunch of different keys that are still associated to the same account, but be able to separate them to different projects so that if one gets leaked, the entire thing doesn't get leaked and you don't have to create a new API key the entire time. And it's also very nice to always have a validation API key endpoint, where a lot of people are going to want to make sure that their API key works and they are calling a proper kind of curl script, just being able to call your API endpoint properly. And oftentimes I see a lot of different API specifications ignore just the simple win of saying, let's validate it. Let's make sure that it works. Let's do a simple win that doesn't require a bunch of different parameters to put in. Just say, yes, this works. And you can even say how many minutes you've used, how much money has it cost. You can generate whatever is going to make sense in regards to that. I also like to make sure that we are keeping it simple, where we are making it clear how to create a call, and we're also making it clear what the response of these calls are, where you want to make sure that the expectations between different user levels is still clear. So you're going to have the people who are very experienced in APIs who are going to just kind of run through everything without making anything just kind of an issue of, oh, I'm not going to read every single part of documentation. That's not what's important to me. But then you're also going to have people who are going to not really understand how something is built. So making sure that you are properly documenting what the response body is going to look like. As I can see, this is an actual example of a response body that we're showing within our documentation over here. But also making sure that it just isn't too boggy to run down. You can direct people to other documentation if you want a full area of that. Make sure you're labeling and organizing your JSON well, where you can use tools like JQ to make sure that you are actually formatting JSON in a way that is readable to human eyes instead of just readable to computers. And once again, just kind of hammering down the idea of consistent parameters across different endpoints. Examples of quality docs. So this is kind of the area that I like talking about, taking advantage of other things that you're already using. So if you're using existing third-party APIs in your stack, or if you're taking a look at your previous employers, look at their documentation pages and look at their specification docs and take advantage of what they're doing right and see if you can apply that to your own documentation. Similarly, take a look at your competitors' docs and see if they're doing anything that you want to be doing or not doing, as well as your internal docs to make sure that you're just doing things that are going to be intuitive to your developers. I like taking a look at Slack, Stripe, GitHub, and Twitter as examples of documentation that I've had a good time with, but take advantage of what's going to be relevant towards the industry and the marketplace and the developers that are going to be using yours. What are they familiar with? What do they consider to be good documentation? And customize it towards that. There are documentation platforms that are going to be able to help you with this, where they will help validate your OpenAPI spec, but also just make the experience a lot better instead of having to build it all yourself. There are a lot of different examples, like Remy.com, who provides it as a software as a service, but there's also open source ones like Redocly, DapperDocs, Widergen, Swagger UI. They're all going to provide very easy ways for you to put in your raw API spec and give you some documentation. You're of course going to want to customize it a little bit after that, but it takes a lot of the hard work that is mostly just kind of not the difficult part, but just kind of the tedious part out of the way for you. And this is also going to help ensure that the public-facing endpoints work, where they're going to generate sample code for you automatically, so you don't have to write your own. And they're also going to allow you to make calls within the website most of the time, so that you don't have to go into your terminal or into your code editor. You can just do it immediately from there, because if you're keeping your users and your developers on your documentation website, they're going to be able to explore more. You don't want them to leave. You want them to learn more and stay there. So this is an example of our documentation website where we are showing off a couple different things, where we have this endpoint. This is our get enhanced results endpoint, where we have a couple different things. You can see all the different languages on the top right, where we also have our authentication section, where you can directly put in your API key, and it's going to allow you to call this input directly within the documentation and API reference website. You can put in the parameters. So here we have a job ID, we have a description for everything, and we have all the different responses that you might get. You can even click on all the different responses to see what is going to be inside of those responses if there is more complicated stuff going on within there. So then we can see all the different languages. It's going to show you what the code looks like in real time so that you can copy it directly to your own workspace. And then it's going to show you the response after you click try it, where it's actually going to make a real API call using your API key and show off everything that is happening within there. And this is all living on your documentation website. So let's talk about the elephant in the room too, technical debt, where it's really hard to change existing infrastructure. A lot of teams often like to shovel aside all the technical debt in favor of wanting to build new and fun and exciting, interesting tools. But the issue is it gets even harder to remove technical debt the longer you let it acclimate, where if you just kind of leave it there and you keep on building more and more and more things on top of it, the more that becomes the weakest link in the entire infrastructure of your development kind of interface that you're showing off to all your different users. When you have technical debt, oftentimes this is going to turn off new users from using you as opposed to people who are building on the more robust and newer pieces of kind of software and infrastructure that are going on. And you're also going to see existing users be poached away from you, where if there is a competitor that has completely revamped things to use things in a better way, they're going to jump ship and go to somebody else. Additionally, there's also always the security vulnerability issue, where the longer you hold on to your old content and your old dependencies, the longer it's going to kind of be around for people to add vulnerabilities into it and to be able to attack it. So you do want to keep on doing the new thing so that you keep your users happy, excited, and secure. So one way that I like to kind of encourage people to get rid of technical debt is to think agile, using product management techniques to get user stories, where you can think of the as a blank, I want to blank so I can blank story, trying to really think about the customer, about the developer, about the user, so that you can actually try to get to the core, what do people want to use versus what would be fun to build. You really want to make sure that you're kind of building towards actual useful and desired opportunities. Scrum Masters can be useful for this, but I also highly recommend talking to your developer relations team. I recommend talking to your sales team. Like, what are people actually looking for? What are they interested in? And I like to create goals to chunk out the technical debt, where if you can break things out into subcategories to get a lot of small wins, that's going to make your team a lot more motivated to keep working, as opposed to having a smaller amount of larger wins, where people are going to get tired because halfway through they're going to be dismotivated that they haven't finished it yet. Where if you break it up into chunks, you're going to have a lot of people feel like they're being positively reinforced. They are having victories. So you just need to keep on chunking them out. You can use tools like Notion, Jira, Asana, and other product management tools to help organize these, just to make sure that you have a proper game plan and then it's also visible to your internal teams and internal stakeholders to make sure that people know where the priorities actually are and where they should continue going. I like to make sure that we are dogfooding everything as well. And what dogfooding is making your team actually use the API internally, where you aren't just showing this off to a bunch of customers and developers, you are actually using it yourself, where you can be doing things like getting internal tools to be developing something that makes sense for your existing workspace, but then also getting feedback from other teams. You have a lot of developers in your team likely, but they've never touched your API before. So why don't you have like a little show and tell time and get feedback from the developers that you already know and already work with, so that you don't have to rely on getting customers upset and not enjoying your product. You can get direct feedback from people who want to actually see the success. Utilize your developer relations team if it's available. We have a lot of insights towards making sure that things are intuitive and easy to use, because as I've mentioned at the very beginning, we use a lot of different APIs. And gather trusted user feedback. Like if you do have customers who are your champions and who have been with you since day one, or just have been really great people to work with, take advantage of them. Like see if they are willing to give you some feedback and do a nice little info session with you to give some kind of ideas of what they think would work best for you. And this is all in addition to automated testing. This is not in replacement of making sure that your automated tests work. This is just all meant to work together just to build a very robust, but also very nice to use platform in the first place. So an example of us dogfooding within Dolby.io is using Dolby.io media with our Box integration, where we are working on a lot of different things that involve audio and video files. So for example, I've actually been working a lot on making a lot of different videos. So every single project that we make, we put through our Enhance API to improve the audio quality. And this is our own tool, this is our own API, and we are using it ourselves so that if we do see something wrong, if the output that we're getting from the video or audio file doesn't sound better, that is a sign immediately to go to our engineering team and go, what's going on? Why is this not working properly? This is going to be a really nice tool to make sure that you're taking advantage of something that you're actually building so you can see what the actual use case and what the developer experience is going to look like, and can continue kind of making it go through, where we are able to enhance within Box, but you can also do it in Python, JavaScript, Shell, and so on as alternatives. And we also do the same thing with things like transcoding and music mastering as well. Another example is on our communications side, we have an API for video calls, but we want to make sure that we're actually using this for video calls in the first place, where we use this to expose what the average user workflow is going to be, find common use cases, and see what nice to have features there would be. Like if you're on a video call and you see that there are certain settings that are missing that you would expect to use, you would want to relay that to your own team. You want to actually try it out and make sure that it's working the way that you would expect it to. And one of the really cool things about a live API like this is that developers get very curious when quirks happen in the real time, where if there is a glitch or something isn't happening as expected, they get very motivated and very excited to figure out what happened there. And the more you actually use these tools, the more exposure they're going to have towards seeing it actually work live and seeing what that use case is actually going to be outside of their test environments. So as I kind of close out this conversation, I just want to reiterate that everything is a work in progress. We're still in a work in progress at Dolby.io. This is not an example of we're being perfect. This is just a lot of different tips that I've been trying to work with the entire team to improve all this together. And you should be thinking about it this way too. But remember that the best way to get this through is through constant communication. You're going to be working with teams all over the place in areas like product, engineering, marketing, sales, and even more, depending on how your company structure is built. So make sure you're not keeping to yourselves, but you're communicating with each other and trying to figure out the best ways to make this all move forward, because you're all a team at the end of the day and you all want to see it succeed. So that's all I have for right now. Thank you so much for showing, and I'd love to hear if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Griffin. One question about the culture there. Like you talked about like how to put it with the teams and working with the teams, but how was like the involvement of higher management into this? Was it really a bottom-up approach or top-down approach or both?
We've actually been very lucky in that our VP for the Dolby.io department, who runs the entire department, actually comes from a developer relations background. So she's actually been the biggest champion of making sure that it works and that it's intuitive and that developers actually want to use it. So there definitely is a very great support from the upper management, but you can't always rely on having that. So having a bottom-up approach is also an important thing to have. The way I like kind of thinking about it is it's kind of like a binary search where you want to be approaching it from both directions instead of just one. So being a champion from the lower ground and actually talking to the individual engineers and the individual people who are actually building it is going to be just as important as having that be a priority from upper management, because you just want to make sure that every single person is on the same page and on board with these improvements, because that's what's actually going to cause change to happen.
So the next talk is about OpenAPI version 3 compared to other versions. At some point internally, did you have any discussion on that? It was obvious to use one specification versus another on the versions.
Yeah, I think we just kind of stuck with the most modern version of OpenAPI than at the time that we were starting all of it. I wasn't part of that discussion. I actually joined after that decision was made. And that kind of goes with the area of technical debt as well, where usually there's probably going to be a reason that you're going to want to upgrade eventually. And the sooner you upgrade, the sooner it is going to kind of be easier to continue improving and modifying it. That's kind of my opinion towards it, but I'm very curious to hear what the next talk has to say about if that's worth it or not, because I don't have a clear answer to that.
Yeah, let's listen to the next talk. We have a last question, 5 seconds. How can we get a t-shirt like yours?
So this was a t-shirt that we were giving out at our time at South by Southwest. Make sure that you just keep up to date on all the different events that Dolby.io is going to. We have an events page at dolby.io/events where you can see where we're going to be in the world. And we do have a very awesome marketing team who designs some really cool swag that we love to give out. So keep an eye out on where we're going to be next, and we'll have some exclusive content for you to hopefully pick up.
Perfect, Griffin. Thank you very much, and looking forward to having you at one of our next event.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
So much.
And so now we'll have this discussion about OpenAPI specification. Yes, but which one? So we will have Arnaud Loré on stage talking to us about OpenAPI 3 does what Swagger 2 doesn't. Actually, is the word Swagger still allowed to pronounce, Arnaud?
No, you have to put 10 euros in the Swagger jar.
Yeah, the Swagger jar. So yeah, and where the money of the Swagger jar goes?
To any charity you want.
Yeah. Okay. So okay. So now I have a hard time. So if I pronounce it, I don't push for the last name, the OpenAPI specification. But if I pronounce it, I give it to charity. It's really hard now. So yeah, Arnaud. Yeah, the stage is yours for 25 minutes, 20 plus 5. Yeah. Wow. And I already see some awesome slides there.
Thank you. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm Arnaud Loré, also known as API Handyman on Twitter, and that's also the name of my blog. I work at Postman in the Open Technology team as the OpenAPI tech lead. The Open Technology team aims to educate people around APIs, specification, and so on. I also wrote a book called The Design of Web APIs, which is obviously about the design of web APIs. And it has been translated from English to Japanese, Korean, and Russian. Just a few seconds about the reference behind this session for those who are not as old as me. In the 90s, there was a rivalry between Sega and Nintendo, and in America, Sega of America launched a series of advertisements. Genesis, the Sega Genesis, does what Nintendo don't, to bash a little bit their adversary. So let's see if that's the case with OpenAPI and Swagger. Let's talk about the history. Where does Swagger and OpenAPI come from? So in 2011, the team that was working on the WorldNic Online Dictionary was struggling with generating SDKs and API documentation. So to solve that problem, they created a suite of libraries and tools that they called Swagger, that was most known for the UI that was used for rendering the API documentation, which was called Swagger UI. This UI was powered by a JSON document, which was not really important at that time. In 2014, Swagger 2 was released. So there was the new Swagger UI, a new Swagger editor that put the Swagger 2 specification up to the prompt. That's the moment I actually discovered the specification. In 2015, the Swagger 2 specification, thanks to some brilliant mind, was donated to an organization that was under the Linux Foundation, and this organization was called, and this is still called, the Open API Initiative. And so the Open API specification was born. The Swagger brand and the tools stayed the propriety of SmartBear. So it's actually not Swagger versus OpenAPI. It's about Swagger then OpenAPI, because there was Swagger 3 and now the Swagger 2, sorry, and now there is OpenAPI 3. So OpenAPI is just the new version of Swagger. Nowadays, there are two versions of OpenAPI 3 which are available. The 3.0, which was released in July 2017, and the 3.1, which was released on February last year. Nowadays, tools usually support version 2, version 3.0, and they start to support version 3.1. And so, yes, OpenAPI 3 is the new version of Swagger 2, which was a great specification, and OpenAPI 3 make it even great. It improves the structure, the way you describe hosting, security, how you describe the interface contract, and documentation. So let's take a look at all those improvements. First, structural modification. In a Swagger 2 document, the version of the specification used was indicated by a Swagger property. It has to be changed into an OpenAPI property. By the way, when you create a specification, whatever it is, it's a very good idea to put the version of the spec inside the document. That way, the work of parsing documents will be easier for people creating tools. And also, when you find a document, you know in which version of the spec it is. Not to confound with the version of the API, which is in the info.version property. The main modification in the structure of a document, which has been brought by OpenAPI 3, is a better separation between what was reusable across the document and what was just a definition, especially at the root level. In Swagger 2 document, you have, for instance, the parameters property, which is at the root of the document. Many people were thinking that all parameters defined at this level were applied to all operations of the API, which was not the case. The parameters at the root of the Swagger 2 document are reusable parameters that you can use in any operation. So all reusable components are now in a dedicated section, which is called components. This is where you will find the definitions, which are now renamed schemas, the values data model you can use across the API, and parameters, and many other things. One thing that brought OpenAPI 3 is a modification that allows to have better consistency across all you describe in OpenAPI document. Because now in OpenAPI 3, all piece of data is defined in the same way. In Swagger 2, there were two ways of defining data. The one that was used for request and response bodies, a kind of subset of JSON schema, and for parameters and headers, it was kind of JSON schema, but you could not take advantage of reusable schema definition. All this is forgotten, and now in OpenAPI 3 and 3.1, you can define data models in component schemas. For example, a resource ID, which is used in parameter or in response of a request. And so you can use this schema in parameters, in headers, in request bodies, and in response bodies. So you define it once and you use it anywhere. And so that ensures a certain level of consistency in your API definitions, and also that simplify the API designer's jobs or anyone jobs who is to actually write OpenAPI definition. With OpenAPI 3, we have more reusable components, especially examples. I will come to that later, and headers. Regarding where your API is hosted, in Swagger 2, you had at the root level 3 properties: schemes, host, and base path, which allow you to define where your API is exposed, but you can define a single point of exposition. In OpenAPI 3, you can define as many points of exposition you want, one too many, which is interesting. For example, you could have a production server, a mock server, a qualification server, or whatever. You can also take advantage of variables when you define your servers. So here I have a single server, which can be a mock server or the real server. And all these possibilities are really wonderful, for instance, when you want to configure an API gateway. Because in your document, you can put the server for the backend, the server or the front end, which will be shown outside of the gateway, and the gateway will deal with that. Another area which has been enhanced is security. So there are no big structural change on this part. Just security definition, which was at the root level, is moved to inside components as security schemes. But the existing security schemes have been upgraded. So for instance, basic authentication is replaced by HTTP, which proposed basic authentication and authentication with a bearer token. API key is not modified. OAuth2 security definition has been slightly fixed using names that are more directly related to the different flows that actually exist. And there were some URL that were missing, that were added. New in 3 also, the possibility of secure API with OpenID Connect. And in 3.1, you can tell that your API is secured with mutual TLS, which is a way of securing API that is often used in corporate environments. And again, all that will simplify the way you can configure the exposition of your API on API gateways. Let's talk about data now. Actually, we could do several sessions about the improvements regarding the definition of data in OpenAPI 3. I only have 20 minutes, so I will try to focus on the main elements. The first one is with OpenAPI 3, we have better and newer JSON schema-ish, in a sense that we move from JSON schema draft 4 to JSON schema draft 5. And in both cases, in Swagger 2 and OpenAPI 3, there are some extra properties that were added by the specification. So basically now in OpenAPI 3, you can take advantage of the one-off, any-off, and not property that allows to combine different various JSON schema together, which is very useful. And there is also the write-only property that allows you to tell that this property is only used when on a write operation. There was read-only on the Swagger 2 version, but not the write-only. And with the combination of the two, it's really useful to describe a single schema that will be used both in reading and writing. That makes the specification more simpler to describe and more simpler to use. In 3.1, we jump to the latest version available, or at least the version what was available at the moment of the specification was released, so draft 2020-12. And icing on the cake, in OpenAPI 3.1, you can tell which version of JSON schema you use. So if you want to use older version, you can. But if a new version of JSON schema is released, you will be able to use it in your document by indicating in $schema the version you are actually using. Obviously, that means the parser you will use needs to manage that version. But that way, that makes the specification future-proof. So you can be sure that if you design your schema with a specific version of JSON schema, you put it in your spec and it will always work. And if newer versions arrive, you will be able to use them seamlessly. Another improvement regarding data is OpenAPI free as an enhanced management of content negotiation. So in Swagger 2, you could say that get/resource produce data which are in application/JSON or text/CSV. The problem is that you could define a single schema for both content type. With OpenAPI free, the produces property has been removed, and now you define the content type of the response body or the request body inside a content property using specific keys like application JSON or text CSV. And so you can define a specific schema for each content type. That allows to have better definition of your API if you take advantage of this HTTP feature. Yet another improvement regarding data, you can now have a more, let's say, complete way of describing complex parameters or header, especially the serialization. In Swagger 2, you could say that, let's say, for instance, a query parameter was an array. And you could say, okay, this property will be represented as a CSV string, so value separated by string or by multiple values, for instance, name equal value 1, name equal value 2, and so on. But nothing regarding objects. In OpenAPI free, you can serialize objects and array in headers or query parameters using a combination of style and explode. And so you can virtually do whatever you want. Last but not least, regarding data in general, and more like here, the capability of describing your interface contract. In OpenAPI free, you can describe, let's call them in a generic way, reverse APIs. Reverse APIs because these are APIs that are defined by the provider of the API that will be implemented by the consumer of the API and called by the provider. In 3.0, the callbacks were added. The callbacks are used, let's say you do post/resources, which is a long-running operation. And instead of letting consumer doing some polling, you want to provide a way to, as a consumer, as a provider, to tell the consumer that this long operation is done. And so you can describe that by adding a callback in your post/resource operation, describing the operation like any other one with a slash whatever. And it will be up to the consumer to implement that to receive the event of the termination of the long operation. In 3.1, webhooks were added. So callbacks are the call of the callbacks are triggered by a first API call made by the consumer. With webhooks, the provider, from its own initiative, can send an event to the webhook that is implemented by the consumer. And to define a webhook, it's that simple. You define it just like you would define an operation. It's just marked as a webhook. And so that means, as a consumer of this API, you have to implement that. Let's talk about documentation now. One thing that I really like with OpenAPI free, and not only because I was participating to this discussion in the beginning of OpenAPI free, is that you can have multiple examples that are documented. In Swagger 2, you could have example only on response and request bodies, no example on headers and parameters. That was a real problem. And if you wanted to put examples on bodies, whatever request or responses, you could only have one example. You can possibly use a trick by, let's say, cheating with content type, which is inside example, to put multiple examples, but it was not made for that, and the rendering and documentation is not really cool. In OpenAPI 3, you have example on parameters, response headers, request bodies, and response bodies. And you can have multiple examples. So each example is identified by a specific key. You can have a summary, a description, a value, or an external value. So instead of putting the data inside the document, which can be a problem sometimes with certain type of data, you can provide a URL that points to an example of documents. Not big improvement, but quite convenient. With OpenAPI 3, we had summary and descriptions added at the path level. So for /resources, I can put a summary and description, just like we had in operation. And with 3.1, a summary has been added in the information. That looks like it's not a big improvement, but having that summary, I've been working on API catalog for my previous company, and we wanted to have a short description of the API. And so we did something into the info description telling, okay, we will take the first sentence or all the words that are before a specific separator to make the short description. That was not really convenient. Having a dedicated summary, you can really have a really short description, which is different from the long description. And thinking about providing this short description can also help you designing your API, because if you are unable to describe it with a few words, maybe you have a design problem and you are not designing the right API. And so that way it's consistent all the way. We have summary and description at the API level, at the path level, and at the operation level. So I think it's time to say thank you and goodbye, Swagger 2. You can use OpenAPI 3 now and get all of its exclusive new features for free, or almost, because let's talk for a few seconds about the path to OpenAPI 3 upgrade. The first thing you need to do if you are already using Swagger 2 is to check all the third-party tools you are using, open source tools, but more important, vendors tools, because open source tools are usually up to date and at least support OpenAPI 3. But for vendor tools, sometimes they can take a very long time. I waited for 3 years that my API gateway vendor in my previous organization did the update. So check with them and don't hesitate to yell at them, to gently tell them that it is time to upgrade to OpenAPI 3 and 3.1. Then you have to upgrade all your toolings. Usually you take advantage of open source parsers, so it should not be a big deal. And then you may convert your existing documents. So no worries about that. Converting Swagger 2 document to OpenAPI 3 document is quite simple. There is no loss. And there are many tools. You can go check a website called openapi.tools that lists many tools that use OpenAPI, and there is a section regarding converters. Okay, so this is the end of this session, and I hope that now you will, if you are still using Swagger 2 and didn't knew what were the possibilities of OpenAPI 3, you are convinced to make the jump, and your world will never be the same, to paraphrase the Sega advertisement.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. Again, awesome slides. Like a lot of work. I love the video games comparison. Just one quick question. So it seems we have to manage already like a lot of API versions, which are sometimes documented or not. Then OpenAPI definitions, right? About all these versions. And now there is also a version of versions, like the version of the spec we use, right? So do you see like how to manage this fragmentation of API version under API specification versions? Like it can be really complex. At some point, it would be like Android or operating system. You have like 5-6 cohorts living in the same time. How can you manage that on a guidelines aspect?
You have to support multiple versions of the specification. That's mandatory. But you have to be careful to stick to the latest version as much as possible. And frankly, usually moving from an older version to a new version, you don't have loss. So it's not really a big deal. You can run a batch to upgrade everything. If you are using tools, you have to upgrade them. But really, it's at least support 2 versions and upgrade as fast as possible. There is no other way to deal with that. Do not wait for decades sticking with very old version, because you will not be able to take advantage of all the new features.
And would you agree with, let's say, this statement that when a new version comes, and let's say when you decide to adopt a new version, you should impose the fact that all new APIs must be under the latest version?
Yeah, I think that's a good practice to do that. But that means you have prior that you have upgraded all your tools, your CI/CD or whatever, that take advantage of the specification to support the latest version.
So once you decided to go to 3.0 or 3.1, version 2 or the Swagger or whatever, the old one can still live. But let's say, sometimes some companies do no more investment in a version that is not on the latest.
Yeah. And then you can add rules if you are using tools such as Spectral, which is an open API linter. It can lint any other type of JSON or YAML document, but you can add a new rules, which is in the beginning a warning. Warning, you are using a Swagger 2 specification. You have to move to another version. And then later, you can make it an error and block the deployment of the API, for instance.
Yeah, perfect, Arnaud. Thank you very much for that talk. Thank you for being there again for these awesome slides. And we'll continue this, let's say, open specification mindset track with Carol Russer, who is a VP and CEO at SAP Concur, and she will be talking with us about the consumer mindset around the APIs. So yes, we build specs and standards and specifications, but for what? For the consumer mindset. Hello, Carol. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I invite you to share your slide. We're really glad to have you. And let's talk about the why of this, the consumer mindset around APIs. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. So this, it's pretty funny. I wrote my first API many years ago, so I'm dating myself a bit. Actually, back in the mainframe days, and I didn't quite realize at the time in my early 20s exactly what I was doing in the grand scheme of things. And then over the years, of course, in the last 5 or 6 years, especially with microservices, it's been interesting to sort of circle back around and see how the industry thinks about APIs and approaches APIs. And so my focus today is to talk about the challenges of APIs that are built without the consumer mindset, and offer you some ideas based on my experience on how to address that. And like I mentioned, it's an industry-wide challenge. We have engineers, product teams building APIs for everything. So if you have a microservice, you should have APIs as we make that shift. But is that really the right approach? If the consumer is not considered, will the API be useful? Why did we build it? Is it being designed with the appropriate intention so that it actually provides value? And the takeaway for today, and my intention, is to make sure that you understand the consumer mindset about APIs and why it is important. The difference between what I call a consumer and a stakeholder and why it matters. And then an introduction to why guiding or governing principles are important to an API success model. And so let's dive right into it. first of all, let's talk about the consumer mindset and why APIs are important. So I used to give this talk in a slightly different way, more about me speaking to very specific items and elements and what we should do. And what I have learned over time is it's really more effective to present in a question format so that folks who are interested in understanding the topic can really think about and take the questions back to where they are today and apply those, right? And ask those same questions in their environment. So questions that I like to ask, I'll give some context to each one of these. How would you define who the consumer of your APIs are, right? And so we have a lot of different approaches and people and personas involved when it comes to APIs. Do your teams engage directly with the API consumer or with a stakeholder who represents the consumer? For example, an API consumer could be a client, right? So maybe you have a product and the clients use the APIs maybe to extend your product, right? Or maybe sometimes in some cases to get data, right, from the product for whatever they're doing, especially in a software service environment. Or an API stakeholder. So maybe it's a stakeholder, maybe it's the folks, the business development team, right, who represents the stakeholder, or an alliances team internally within your company. So when you think about consumers and stakeholders, there's really a broad set of personas out there other than the developer, who is obviously a stakeholder as well. Would you agree or disagree with APIs being part of the SDLC, the software delivery lifecycle? Does your organization treat APIs as a product? As we just heard in the previous conversation, one of the questions that came up was around versioning, right? API versioning. It's really critical, right, that we take that into consideration as part of our guiding principles when building APIs, but there's a life cycle to it, right? So if we were to treat APIs as a product, right, we would have a full life cycle, just like we would with a customer or an actual product that we put in production. During API conceptualization, so just the sheer thought that pops into your mind about building an API, do your product teams engage those stakeholders or those consumers, right, to bring in that input and make sure that the value is being there? What challenges are you facing today when APIs are built without the consumer in mind? And so what are those challenges that may be happening? And I can give you specific examples, probably talk through 20 solid minutes about examples of these, but APIs without pagination or filtering. It's really challenging for a partner, for example, or a situation where pagination or filtering is handled differently by various teams if your partners are trying to interact with different products, right, and bring the data together across your different products, and now you're having to interact with the APIs in a different way. And that can be really challenging because the consumer, the person who's on the other end of that trying to pull that information in. So your takeaway, just keep the consumer in mind when you're building APIs. And then let's talk a little bit more about what does she mean by consumer and stakeholder. This is really confusing, and I can certainly understand that. Let me give you a little bit about the context of where I'm coming from. So the company that I work for, we produce enterprise software, right? So we're not Slack, we're not Facebook. We are building software that corporations consume, right? And so that corporation has many different personas across the board, and there are tens of thousands of customers, right? So why do they need APIs? Who uses them? And what are they trying to do? And I would say most of the time, in our case, they would be trying to extend our solutions. And if you take just a simple solution, say you have a travel solution and an expense product, or a travel product and expense product. So that's our specialty, travel and expense. But our specialty is not the surrounding business processes or compliance that may be wrapped around the spending of the money, right? And so the taxes or being able to grab that information and tie it back into your back-end systems, and then learn from that data and figure out if you're having any compliance situations or scenarios. Well, that's not really the specialty. And so clients and partners may want to extend that software. And so how do we make it easy for them to do that? And how do we make it easy for them to do that across our suite of products, not just, you know, one or two? And that's really hard, because if we deliver our org chart, right, that it makes it really complicated if we're not looking across the products or taking the consumer or the stakeholder in mind. And so I'm going to show you just a really brief example of, if you look at what I would call current models that I have seen across a few different companies where I have worked. You have your APIs, so you have the technology, a very technology driven big set of APIs, potentially across multiple products, built potentially, you know, one or more APIs across microservices or individual microservices. But we have a lot of different consumers, right, based on the example that I just gave when it comes to enterprise software. So how do you make sure that you know, all of these APIs that are being built, and then you have a partner or a client who needs to now navigate across potentially thousands of APIs or hundreds of APIs, how do they tie that together and orchestrate it into a solution? And then what if those APIs are built differently, potentially with different guidelines and versionings, and it really can become complex. But there is the potential and the model that you can put in place if you're thinking about the consumer and you're putting yourself in the position of the companies who are trying to consume your APIs. And so if you made a shift, and this is just a proposed idea that I've been putting in place across the board when I give these talks, is shifting from that technology-driven innovation to the consumer or the value-based innovation. And so just a pictorial view, sure, you still have your APIs and services and maybe your layers of platform wrapped around it, and then your product and innovation, maybe an API program. But then you have those stakeholders, right, who are representing maybe the clients or the different partners, and then the actual consumers of the APIs. And so if you come into approaching APIs as a product and actually treat it using Product Management 101, then you're shifting the use and the value conversation over to the left, right? And you're thinking about that up front. And in some cases, the consumer could be an internal development team, right? If you're building platform-based APIs. So it could be internal, could be external, could be public, could be private, but you really need to pull all that together up front before we go too far down the line. And so that's what when I talk about consumers and stakeholders, you know, the business development team, the marketing teams, the administrators, the people who are using your products, those are the personas, right, that need to be considered. And so the takeaway here is just, you know, giving those examples of why it's important as an engineer, as a product person, to have those conversations up front, and maybe even consider looking at it an extension of that. Maybe it's beyond that. Maybe it's beyond APIs as a product. Maybe it's platform as a product. Whatever the spin or whatever terminology is, because platform is probably somewhat of an overused word. Make sure that you're having those conversations earlier in the discussion. And so a little bit about guiding principles and why, or I say governing principles, and why those are important to a successful API program or API success model. That's the term. I like to put success in there because when you use the word governing, I don't know, like when I was a developer, it can feel a little, you want to shy away from that. Like, I don't want you to tell me what to do. You know, I want to be a developer because I want to be creative, but you have to have principles in place, especially in the enterprise software world and when it comes to APIs. And so there are so many books and articles out there about API design standards. You know, again, using that same approach as I used at the beginning, asking these questions in your company or where you work, or, you know, whatever you're doing, you know, what has been your experience following the standards and practices? Do you get positive feedback, right, from your product and engineering teams on either the design standards you have in place, or maybe you don't have any at all, or maybe every product that you have has a different design standard, which I have witnessed. I have actually done a discovery before at a company where there were 6 different design standards, and well, then you know why your consumers and your clients and part are very confused when they're trying to use those APIs. Does your company have internal versus public versus private APIs, and what in the world does that mean, right? And it could be the mechanism by which you choose to publish the API. So you build the API, you've built it with a consumer mindset in mind. Every API that you build, right, should be extensible. You should be able to extend it and offer it to for the public use, right? Whether it be your clients or your partners. But maybe there are situations where you want to keep it private. Maybe there's a limited use case. And it's not an API that would be exposed publicly, or maybe it's just built for internal purposes, right, where it needs to be used. So those types of things, breaking down those definitions and knowing what practices to apply are important. Do you have disparate product teams who own APIs, right? And so if you have many microservices, if you have multiple products in the suite of products that your company may sell, are they using do you have those different teams? And then what are the challenges that you face today across with consistency, security, reliability? Again, going back to these governing principles. Another question to ask is, how does your organization manage changes to APIs? So we just heard about that in the previous discussion. Versioning, right? What is the approach? What do we do? What if you have a product that's been in production for 15, 20 years, right, in enterprise software, and you've got APIs that have been built for the last 10 or 12, what do? They've been using these APIs. You have versioning. You need to have control. Every time you change an API, it could effectively be affecting thousands of clients. And then how do you move them from the old over to the new for the various reasons? So the versioning principles and the guidelines and deprecation policies are super important. And then how do you measure success of your API program from a maturity level? How do you look at that? How do you know where you are today and where you want to be, and then the paths to get there, which is often scoped into a capability maturity model, like people, process, and technology. So your takeaway here in the sharing of this information is to keep guidelines and consumers top of mind for API success. And so I put this in here to give a visual to what I talk about when I refer to a maturity model. I did a ton of research probably about 5 years ago on, what it's a struggle. It's a struggle sometimes when we've built APIs somewhat ad hoc, maybe over the years. It's the next best thing to do, but then how do you recover from that if maybe it's gotten out of hand? And so this is an example of a maturity model I put together over just a lot of different research. You can see my sources up on the left-hand side, and applied just a regular CMM approach to it across the people, process, and technology. So how would you measure yourself, and where do you want to go? Maybe it's not as important for the APIs that you build that the process is in place. Maybe your company's small enough that you can keep that fairly well set. But in other enterprise software companies, it's really important, right? We need to have those controls in place, and when we make changes or when we make decisions to build APIs, it's a life cycle from beginning to end, right? When you may choose to decommission an API, and it can take years. It can take years to make that shift. So this becomes super important in that context. And so overall, the takeaway that I would like for you to have is, you can use these questions yourself. With your company, you're thinking about those different components around the consumer mindset and why APIs why it's important to have the consumer mindset when building APIs, understanding the difference between a consumer and a stakeholder, and why does that even matter? I know as a developer, and I work with engineers every single day, we have something to do, we go in, we build the API, or even within the product teams, but are we thinking about how it's being consumed, even in technology, right? How I go in and have to authenticate as a partner to be able to get access to a client, and is that easy for me to do, and how do I navigate that? And just really thinking about the consumption side of navigating APIs in your developer portal. I mean, the whole thing, right? Wrapping it in there. And then those governing principles towards the end. Why is that important? What is your API success model overall? And so I hope this has been helpful. I know it's a fairly quick talk. My name is Carol Russell, and like I said, I've been doing this a long time, and I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carol. So the first question is like the same question I asked this morning to Chet Kapoor is like, when in your mindset, let's say, at least in your mind, but we've shifted from the word integration to consumption. For me, it's like we're in the API product mindset has been there. So did you identify it in the past? How do you see it?
I think it depends on whether or not you're applying a business model to it, actually, right? Like there are problems that we need to solve to be able to connect systems together, right? So maybe we need an API simply for an integration, right? Literally, we're just building it to tie two services together. That's one business reason. That's the value, right, of that API and what you're doing. But when you talk about consumption-based and the consumer, you may have a business model in place. Maybe your business model from a business development and sales perspective is I can offer the ability to extend our products, but I want to make sure that for the entire usage of this API or this set of APIs or this product for a partner, for example, to come in and extend the product. Maybe we want to charge based on that consumption. So what is the business model? What is it we're really trying to do in the end? And so I think the answer to that question to me is sort of going back to the purpose of this presentation. What's the consumer? What's the purpose? What's the value that you're bringing to the table? And if there's a business model wrapped around it from a consumption standpoint, then that's part of what you're taking into consideration when you build the API itself or the program that's wrapped around it.
Yeah, I really love this idea. When there is a business model, it's consumption, it should be a product. When it's just for making things works, it's a more technical approach and integration. I really like this idea. One question also do you make a difference between the consumer and the customer about APIs?
So it depends. And that's why I tell you what, I actually struggled with this over time, trying to figure out how to take something. I mean, it's somewhat of a complex topic overall. And when every company, every product has a journey to their current state. And so a product, for example, like the ones that I deal with, they've been in production for many, many years. If I'm building a new product, I may have a different state to which I am coming to that. And so I think, answering any of these questions to me is about what's your current state, where are you in this journey, and where do you plan on going in this journey? And then you can kind of figure out how to navigate it, because we're not all the same. You see what I mean? Like it's not a one size fits all. It's about knowing what are all the touch points that you need to be thinking about in order to be successful, right? And I think that changes because it's different. Every journey to that current state is going to be different. I don't know if I answered that question, but.
No, yeah, it is. I really loved your maturity model, like the different steps. I tried to screenshot it. I didn't want to wait for the video to be able to analyze it better. But the thing is, how do you align the IT maturity and the business maturity on all of these steps? Can one go before the other, or no, it has to be both in the same time for every maturity level?
It depends. Again, right? If I were starting from scratch and I had a fresh slate, right, I would. Just like, I don't know if you've ever seen there's several like YouTube videos out there with around technology, but if I were starting with a fresh slate, I would completely start value driven, right? I can build a lot of APIs, right? We know how to build APIs, but if I don't really have a purpose of what I'm going to do with them, then technology driven innovation, because someone has to consume that API, just seems very backwards to me. If I start with consumer-driven innovation, and keep in mind, the consumer could be other developers. If you're building like platform-based APIs, the consumer could be an actual user, right, of a product. The consumer could be a company, and that company is using software to solve some back-end problems. And so it just depends, right? And I think that's the key. Is asking those questions. That's why I shifted this presentation to a question. Think about these. Ask yourself these questions to figure out what makes the most sense.
I totally agree and understand. So maybe the last question, preparing the talk we have right after. Let's say consumers. The relationship with consumers is most of the time based on branding and trust. Brand is representation of the trust we put in a relationship between two entities, companies, supplier-customer relationship. What would you advise to keep that trust for consumers and for API consumers? Like, what would be your let's say bullet points, elements to enhance that trust?
So I think there are a couple of things. One is, keeping in mind, I'm thinking from a pretty big corporation standpoint. You have to have data privacy, data concerns, legal. In my opinion, you need to have, if you follow, if your company is the size where you need to follow international standards, compliance standards, DPP, GDPR, when you're dealing with partners. And so if your product is taking in clients' data, right, and you're storing that data, and then a partner is going to come use that data, and you have a contract between the partner and the client, and then there's the third piece, who's housing that data, right? There's this triangulation. So you have to have the right legal practices and data privacy practices and contracts in place to make those agreements successful and everyone's being protected. And so that, to me, is a level of trust. And then when you build those APIs, right, you need to apply proper security principles, which we just heard in the previous talk. And that's another reason those governing components are super important, right? To be able to have that trust in place. And if you do go through ISO 9001 or 27001 about how you build your software, and that stamp is what you've committed to your clients, then you have to have the right controls in place along the way. Did you have the consumer? Do you have an SDLC in place? Are you having those checkpoints? Are you making sure that you're not sharing data, right, that shouldn't be shared? And so when I think of trust, right, I think of from all the way from the customer, partner, the client, and then the engineering side. So I see it from both sides, the business and the technology side.
Yeah, we've heard business, technology, regulatory environment, compliance, value. We heard a lot of points here, and I think this is exactly what we will develop with the next panel. Thank you very much, Carol, for being with us. Yeah, it was great, and we'd love to have you again at other Apidays conferences.
Love to. It's fantastic. Love sharing the information. Thank you very much.
Perfect, Carol. Thank you very much. And now we'll have a panel with, let's say, different thinkers and builders of the API space. I'll invite them all on stage. Can we put them on stage, please? About Tara, the API rating agencies. Hello, David, Lorinda, Brian. How are you doing today?
Good. Very well.
How are you, Manny?
I'm feeling well. I'm really excited by this panel, actually. I didn't want to call you the usual suspect of the APIs, but let's say if we were let's say not on stage, I would have said that, but nobody is hearing us publicly, so it's fine. No, the thing is, we have this this vision over the last 10 years, I think, right, about like how we can enhance trust in that whole space. So maybe we can do a quick roundup here to introduce each other, and also what has been this common thinking about like how we can enhance trust in an API rating agency. Maybe David, you want to start?
Sure, thanks, Mehdi. And please don't disappear, because I think you ought to be part of this conversation as well. So let's pull the MC into the panel as well. So I'm David O'Neill. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called API Metrics. And what we've been doing for the last 6 years now is looking at how you can rate and grade the performance of APIs so you can actually mutually agree on what you are getting delivered by the API. And that opened up some interesting questions for me around what is good and what is not. And I've spoken a few times at different API Days events on how we're trying to work out what's good versus what's quality versus what's acceptable can drive you insane in the API space. And I started to realize that it's more than just performance. It's more than just the technical measures of how fast or reliable something is. There's a lot of other factors that I thought we were missing out of the nuts and bolts of whether an API is any good. And this, I think, does follow on from Carol's talk she just gave on the nature of quality, what goes into that. And last year, we decided that we ought to tackle that as a group of, as Mehdi put it, usual suspects in the industry. And what we're going to talk to you today about is that. But I'll let Lorinda go next with her introduction.
Thank you. So I'm Lorinda Brandon. I've been in the software industry for ages, longer than most people have been alive, I think. But and I've been in this API conversation for a good 15 years or so. And I think, I know Mehdi and I have met at many API conferences, including API Days multiple times. And I'm very frequently, you'll find me talking about things like API monitoring and keeping an eye on third-party APIs that you're relying on. And I think as this industry matures and as our individual API programs inside our companies mature, it's more and more important for us to have a standard way of measuring those things. So, we started off with the concept of, hey, just don't forget to measure these things. Now we're saying, well, maybe we should figure out how we can speak in a more common tongue about this. And so what I love about TARA, the API ratings agency, is that our mission is really to figure out how do we have a standard measure for the performance, for the reliability, for just the general quality of an API so that we can mature this industry a little bit better. I think Carol had a great segue into this conversation with her discussion about API maturity and trust. So thank you for setting that up for us, Mehdi. But that's what this is all about, is how do we trust? We rely on each other. We rely business to business and internally in our own platforms. We rely on each other. We're not building big monolithic things by ourselves anymore. And so that's kind of the mission that we're on. And I think it's really important.
Yeah, and Brian, for the few who don't know you yet, can you tell us a little bit more about you?
Happy to. Hey, everybody. I'm Brian Costello, and for the last decade or so, I have been passionately engaged in consumer permission data sharing ecosystems, most notably open banking and open finance around the globe. A big part of that passion is focusing on positive outcomes for the users of these ecosystems, the consumers, the investors, the small businesses. They rely on, and we want them to rely on these connected data ecosystems to improve their lives. And if they're going to rely on it, then it has to be reliable. And so a big part of building out these ecosystems is making sure that they are fit for purpose, making sure that the developer experience, that the operational experiences can be measured, can be and can be addressed. Can be fixed if necessary. When as Carol said, when we talked about enterprise type agreements and integrations with APIs, SLAs were part and parcel of that. They were built in, they were measured, there were penalties for it. And as we shifted to these open data ecosystems where developers are consuming APIs and then consumers are consuming the developer's work product, the SLAs have kind of gone away. And so we've got to put measurement in place, and we have to do it in an enforceable manner. And that's what the API rating agency is seeking to do, not to put in place prescriptive values, but start the conversation about what needs to be measured, how do we measure it, and how do we make sure that all the stakeholders are involved in that conversation.
Yeah, and Brian, and I remember 10 years ago when Twitter, let's say, broke their API and all the clients application there, there was a huge movement, at least in the place. And I remember I personally started a blog called API 500, like the standard and poor's of APIs, say, we should do something, we should rate APIs, whatever. But again, when you're alone and the industry is not mature there, but I've seen API metrics and I've seen all the discussion we had at API conferences. And yes, and really, I think it's only a group that can handle this. Yes, and I also remember I spent like 1 year working in trade credit insurance. It's like companies who ensure the fact that the contract will be executed, right? So they put not a gun, but they put money on the table, and they say, each one, if you don't execute the contract, money will come to the one who is the one in default actually will have to pay. But we really put pressure, and also there is a grade. So because there is money, there is a grade the money is higher when the grade is higher and everything. So there is the logistic and the supply chain industry has learned a lot over the last 100 years about how to ensure contracts are respected. In the digital infrastructure space, it's not the case. And I know, Lorinda, you have a clear statement about like how providers should be accountable and how let's say we should democratize the API industry at some point. Can you, it would be a great start if you can elaborate on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm sure I'm not the only one in this boat, but in our business, we are not only producers of APIs that other people will consume, but we are consumers of APIs. We are a SaaS management platform. That means we're consuming the APIs for these big SaaS providers. And man, it is hard to hold them accountable for anything beyond a very basic SLO. And that's not enough anymore. Like just having here's the performance we expect, the response time we expect, that's not enough. And so it becomes very hard to hold the larger API providers accountable for what they're delivering. And so when I talk about the democratization of APIs, it's like my dream is that eventually someday people are going to say, here's our contractual obligation is that you will keep your TARA rating at X. And if it falls below, you're breaching your contract with us. Like that's the ideal. And so if we can create this like holistic score, to your point, Mehdi, about scoring, right? If you have a score that you can hold people accountable to, it means they're delivering the right support, they're delivering the right version control, they're delivering the right performance, they're delivering like all the things that we will come up with as this is what makes a golden API. I think that's key. And then we can be held to the same, like it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's a giant API provider or it's a tiny API provider, we have a commonality, we have a score we can all like look to and say, this is what we're trying to achieve. And then, like I said, my ultimate dream is that we're starting to write that into contracts and say, you won't fall below this score or we get our money back. So that's what I hope for anyway.
Yeah, Brian.
On that, Mehdi, Lorinda's spot on. Obviously, enforcement's the stick. I would love to see TARA and the TARA score, if that's the way we go, become more of a carrot, right? Become a tool that API providers can use internally that they track against, and they see usage go up, and they've got internal processes to say we need to increase bandwidth, we need to increase IOPS, we need to do whatever we need to do, because part of being successful in the digital space is that your cost of doing business goes up. Maybe I'm being a bit Pollyannish on that. And then we can start building that trust mark or awareness of it, so that it's not just contractual enforcement, but it's like it becomes like a net promoter score, a digital net promoter score. But to do this, we need to have commonality in measurement, both in what we're measuring and then how we objectively drive those measurements.
Yeah, and let's remember a little bit like some cases why it's important. We've seen Twitter breaking a lot of APIs. We've seen Facebook a lot, not even noticing for breaking changes. We've been LinkedIn killing startups by changing term of services. We've seen Google. I don't know if you know the Google graveyard. Like so many APIs have stopped without even notice and everything. And so many also smaller cloud providers, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS providers were slow and didn't respect their SLAs, but nobody was there to prove it. So at the end, nobody was compensated where they should have been. So there's many things, right? All the promises that have been shared by CEOs, the head of platforms, never delivered. So yeah, we need more trust, and this is why we're here today. And I will just finish by saying, like, there is hope. There is hope. If you've seen the Google Enterprise API label. So it seems that, yeah, some big players understand that we need to label APIs, but it should not be one provider for its own. You cannot be the judge of yourself, right? It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, we need more independent stuff. You've been doing that for some time, David.
We have. I think following on from your point, the phrase we use a lot when we're meeting with customers and partners is you shouldn't mark your own homework. It would make life much easier at school if you did, but what we see, you mentioned Google. Google are quite bad at this, to be honest. And I say this as a huge Google fan, and we're a Google hosted solution. But proving to Google that they have not met their SLO obligations that they're quite public about having is quite hard. They're not necessarily, you have to prove to them that they have missed their SLO. They won't ever tell you. And it's quite an involved process. Other big cloud vendors are starting to see that. And over the last, I would say, 2 years, which is great for API metrics, but we've seen real attention being paid not by necessarily the engineering groups, but the business groups, to go back to Carol's points of, hang on, we are offering these services, we are charging for these services. We need to understand what it is we are selling. And they're coming at it from a different perspective, which is if we can offer a better level of service that we can prove we offer, we can charge more. And I think that goes to the maturity model of the API economy. And I think what I started with the concept of the API ratings agency and the advisory council was what are we missing? And as Brian said, measurement is one of those things. It still shocks me that there are no common agreed measurement standards. Everybody brings their own favorite measure to the table, and it's usually the gateway log from your side of the equation if you're a provider. You never, ever want to start getting into conversations about the customer's side of the equation from where they're calling from. And just having some best practice on that would be very helpful for the industry. But as we've opened this up, and this is something we're interested in the industry coming back to us with, is we hear about documentation. What constitutes good documentation? Just throwing an open API spec out there is not enough. It needs to have examples. It needs to be usable. Do you stand, to your point, Eddie, behind your API? Are you just going to turn it off on a random whim on a wet Tuesday afternoon without telling anybody, or version it beyond use? What about the data that comes back? How do you stand behind the data coming back, meeting a particular schema? I think as we move forward, looking at the security question and the quality question, actually being able to prove that the data you send back is what you say you're going to send back, in the format you're going to send back, attached to the schema you send back, is an integral part of the quality equation. And not a lot of people are thinking about that yet because it's quite hard to do. But these are things where we need to have best practice and standards for. And what I'm excited by is people are starting to really understand that this isn't the industry has matured in the last decade away from, we've got to have an API, to we have to have something people rely on. And we actually have to understand, to Lorinda's other point, of where we are exposed to other technologies. If AWS Lambdas go down, does that affect APIs that we are using further up in a different app we hadn't even thought of? I think there's a whole network of things that are currently not really thought about in the way people currently measure and verify that things are working. And that's what we're trying to pull together some best practice on and some ways of doing it. And yes, ultimately, my vision is we have a framework for scoring quality. And in the same way that you would check your credit score with a number of agencies before you go and get a loan, people actually go out and verify what the scores are for the services they integrate, rather than, hey, I know what Stripe is. I like Stripe. It's easy to use. I'm going to put it in our application for our payments, without doing any due diligence beyond that, and then leave it to somebody else to try and write a contract around it. I think that's the way we have got to where we are. But looking 5 years from now, I don't think that will be how the industry has evolved, where the industry will be.
So if we go back to what should be measured, right? So you said on the, let's say, more the performance side, like what should be in for performance? You say like what is time to first, the response time, time to first byte, time to last byte. What should be in?
I think all of those could be measured, but I think the key thing is, and we hear this over and over again from API providers, it should be from the point at which you should have a way to agree measurement from the point at which the consumer is calling the API, and look and be rated on their experience. And sometimes there will be problems with the the user's architecture will be causing problems. Sometimes the infrastructure supplying the API will have problems. But having that end-to-end view, I think, is one of the key parts of measuring performance. And then you should get into, do we get back what we expect? Are we getting the response codes we want? There's a lot of shortcuts the industry have taken over the years, and building technology on HTTP codes, if we want to get into the technical weeds, was possibly a bad idea. It's very hard to work out, for example, if a HTTP 400 code is actually something went wrong or your platform's working as expected. And we see over and over again, people just go, well, that's a 400 code. It's not my problem. It's somebody else's. I'll ignore it. And it means their platform's failed, but it's failed in a very creative way. And we also see a reliance on 200 always being a pass. I don't ever wish to make fun of RunScope on this as word, but 200s aren't reliable either. We often see 200s with failure messages embedded or nothing returned at all. These are things that you need to keep on top of and actually have some way of agreeing how you measure them. And we don't actually have any best practice for that at the moment across the industry. I think Lorinda's got some views on that too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think you're touching on something that I think is really important and hard to do. I think we're way beyond the, how fast are you responding? Like the reliability of getting a response. We need to get much more granular around the quality of the response. What is this thing you responded to me with? Is it something I can use? Is it accurate? Is it what everybody is expecting? And so I think that's what David's touching on, and I think it's going to be that's a hard problem to solve from a tooling, metrics tooling perspective. But that I think is key now at this stage of our API maturity as far as an industry goes.
So monitor. No, Brian, you want to say something? Sorry.
I was just saying, and just to add to the complexity, on top of that, we need to look at the customer experience and the developers expecting integrity in the data, integrity in the behavior of the APIs. Multiple APIs are being used in the product to provide the customer experience. So the interrelationship, interoperability between them. What happens? You get a cascade failure, or you get an error code that isn't handled correctly, creates an incredible problem with the reliability. So being able to have a conversation around that to then start building out the framework is essential as well.
I think to follow on from that with Brian, if we go back to one of Carol's points on security, security of APIs, it's not as simple as a website signing in. There can be multiple different APIs involved in using an API in a secure environment that aren't all part of even the same API specification. So if you're calling a financial services API, there can be an API involved in authenticating who the user identity is, then creating a token for the use of the API, and then making the API call itself. So you can have three different pieces that have to work in a timely fashion, in concert together, in order to achieve things. If you look at the way we tend to look at specifications now, that's not really covered, because the Open API specification is about individual single APIs specified. And what we're starting to look at from a business need is API orchestrations across groups of APIs, as Brian said, is becoming important. And that brings us into the other points you touched on, Mehdi.
Yeah, and time is going fast, but we said, okay, the performance is important. The developer experience is important. Docs, code samples, exploration console, time to first hello world under, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, something, right? So like the fact that, it's easy to explore. We talked about security, like do you respect standards? Are you inventing a new weird security protocol for stuff? We had a question in the chat about like, does respecting RFC standard is an example of trust there, but what else could be in? Let me jump into that one. For example, for me, term of services are extremely important. The fact you respect the term of services you wrote, right? And the fact also your term of services, you take engagements like 3 months minimum for noticing for breaking change. You don't revoke for any reason at any time. You always give a reason, or at least you give a warning notice and a period for people to be able to change the behavior that may be not right? But the thing is, term of services are extremely important. And I would add the business model, right? The company policy at some point, because we've seen in the past some company really shifting and breaking everything. Like the fact that the company, I think this is a personal opinion here, but company would engage to say, if we break the API for no reason at some point, there is a compensation at some point, right? Something like that. What else we could put into this global rating?
I think other comments we've had, and we really are looking for feedback and people wanting to get involved in this process. So feel free to email any of us or myself. But other things we've heard is just versioning. How long do people stand behind the version of the API they've released before it stops working?
Yeah.
The data quality or the data freshness that comes back. How often are the services revised? So if you're what is their back end doing in order to serve you fresh data? Or are they just caching everything and they're not paying any attention to that? There's a lot of these other soft metrics, time to first hello world, ease of reading of the documentation. There's a lot of things in here which are not really stored anywhere, but they are things that we know we ought to pay attention to. And I think what we should end up with is some mechanism for grading and measuring the performance quality, but also giving people a score for those soft metrics. Yes, you've got a fast and reliable API, but it's borderline unusable for anybody who comes in fresh. Can you just sign up for a developer account? That sort of part of the process. I've just seen the GGVA Capital have released a list of the API first 50 top API first companies. 15 of the companies on the list, you cannot sign up for a developer account to test the API. In my mind, that's not an API first company. That's a software company who has APIs, but they should have the badge of API first taken away from them. So
this is sorry, David, that's where I was in my head when Mehdi said, what else would you include? That was one that I was going to say. There's a developer experience that has to do with, do you have a sandbox? Like, how easy is it for me to do some integration work and test it before I have to launch? And then I think the other thing I was going to go to Mehdi, is I know you're working on a terms of service project that would help to standardize what the terms of service are, but I think that's key too. It's not just do you stand behind your terms of service, but how decent is your terms of service? How complete is it? What does it have in it? And so I think it's, again, Brian used the word complexity a little while ago. This is no small task we're trying to accomplish, but I think it's time.
Yeah. And it's not just, and there's a whole governance aspect to it. If we look at it, if we look at this issue through a maturity model lens, there's a whole governance of the API. It's not just don't turn it off without warning, but how can developers provide feedback? Is there a community to grow and evolve and the API over time? These things are part of what an API first company would do, and many of them, to David's point, don't.
Yeah, and just to say, I've been doing some work with high manufacturers and supply chain companies, Toyota and others. They would never work and accept to work with someone who is late, who has a weird contract, or does not respect the quality of what they provide and everything. Like, it would be impossible. It would be just impossible to work with this. Why we accept this in digital infrastructure and the API economy?
Exactly.
I don't know.
It is a supply chain issue, and we should take the work that's been done in physical supply chains and apply them to the digital supply chain for this and for third-party risk management.
Well, and just to echo that, it's the same as financial services. You wouldn't buy something from a supplier you hadn't done some basic due diligence on. You just wouldn't. But people integrate to APIs without doing any checks on what it is they've integrated to, and that's not sustainable as businesses become more and more exposed to other providers and to chains of technology.
So just to wrap up, like, how do we see the council working, and how people can be engaged right now? At least we know it's a draft, it's a working group, but how people can be engaged?
So I think the first thing is we are looking for feedback from the industry. We're looking to listen to what people want. Our vision is to release a charter slightly later in the year and start to create working groups to create position papers on the things, the methodologies we think are essential for the industry. But beyond that, we want to be steered by the community. And I see this as a crowdsourced, community-driven endeavor where we agree on what the best practices are. So if you're the head of API program at a large finance institution, you're getting a lot of pushback from your risk compliance group over how you should do some of these things. There'll be something you can take to them and say, hang on, this is what the industry best practice is. I wish to meet the industry best practice. And we're looking for people who want to volunteer for the working groups, but also people who are interested in what we've not thought of that potentially has huge impact on the industry. I'm open to Lorinda or Brian having any additional points on that one.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything David said. We're looking for people to get involved, and we're definitely looking for feedback. We'll be publishing more things more publicly that we can then gather feedback on. And we probably, now that we're all talking about this, David, Brian, we should probably get an email address that people can send to that isn't us.
Yes, that is on my to-do list, and I will be sorting that out shortly.
And really to underscore, we want developers, consumers of APIs, as well as the API providers. And API providers, please come not just to get some ammunition to go back to your risk and compliance people, but to help improve your business, to help you legitimately earn the badge of API first company, and to inject some reasonableess into the conversation, to counterbalance what some of the API consumers are coming to the table with, right? I mean, this is it's an ecosystem, and it's going to be a living, breathing ecosystem that's going to evolve over time. But we need to get the MVP in place first.
Yeah, and again, the engagement I can take on the Apidays part is that if the API rating agency is where its member has gathered, we will do everything we can to gather them on board working groups in the US, in Europe, in APAC, in the conference we run, at least to get the discussion going, gathering API providers, consumers, and sometimes policymakers at some point, they want to be involved. So we've seen that. So yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you, Lorinda. Thank you, Brian, for putting the stage for a long journey about rating APIs to enhance trustworthiness of digital infrastructure. Yes, it's time to make API trustworthy.
It is. Thank you so much, Mehdi. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much, and
thanks
see
all.
you
Be well.
at next working group. And again, I really want to thank all members to have been there to present the initiative. And now it's time for the lunch break. Lunch break if you're in Pacific time zone, like a tea time if you are on the East Coast. And we will be back in 45 minutes. 45 minutes on the different tracks, business tracks, technical track, roundtables, and workshops. So yeah, have a good lunch and see you, or tea, and see you in 45 minutes. Thank you very much.